In the meantime, South Africa has urged the United Nations to deploy what it calls a rapid protection force to intervene in the Israel-Gaza conflict to protect the civilian population from further bombardment. In a hard-hitting statement, the International Relations Ministry highlighted the number of children who have been killed so far in the conflict and also accused Israel of violating international law. Israel has defended the bombardment and ground invasion of Gaza on the grounds of self-defense, following the killing of 1,400 people by Hamas on October 7th. 230 people were taken hostage. Of course, the Hamas-run health ministry in Gaza says more than 8,000 people have been killed since Israel's retaliatory bombing began. The United States and 35 sub-Saharan African countries will meet in Johannesburg for the 20th Africa Trade and Economic Cooperation Forum, AGOA Forum, held from November 2nd to 4th, 2023. This summit entails strengthening trade and investment ties between the U.S. and Sub-Saharan Africa through the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, U.S. legislation which provides various trading or trade preferences to eligible countries in the region. Given Russia's continued war in Ukraine and its rising tension with NATO, plus the China-US trade war, tensions between East and West are high. South Africa has come under attack for its non-alignment role in the Ukrainian war. It refused to support United Nations resolution condemning Russia. This resulted in some U.S. congressmen pushing for the forum to be moved out of South Africa. To, of course, further discuss this, I'm joined by Gideon Chitanga, an international relations diplomacy expert. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Now, let's talk about the importance and also significance of AGOA to South Africa and sub-Saharan countries, and of course, the United States.
So I think that obviously the trade relations are very important between the African countries participating in the AGOA framework. And it's mainly because the framework provides for trade, and African countries, I guess, would be very pleased to use this platform to try and leverage more trade concessions and a more definitive, expanded way of engaging with the U.S. For the U.S., we know that the Biden administration has said that Africa, broadly, and South Africa is very important to its interest, given the context that you summarized earlier, which basically defines the global security and economic context. I would think that after the U.S. sort of overlooked Africa for so many decades, if you would like, but more in a pronounced way during the Trump administration, Biden is emphasized that he's applying what he calls a back-in policy into Africa. And so the AGOA Forum would be a key platform for observers to evaluate the U.S. commitment to the African continent, but also for governments and policymakers to get a proper feel to see whether what the U.S. promised from the past November during the summit that was held in the U.S., the U.S.-Africa summit, whether the follow-up would provide anything that would be interesting and satisfying and beneficial to the African countries that are participating within AGOA. The second thing is the big issue also that you highlighted, the geopolitical context. There are growing relations between amongst countries from the global south, and this includes China. China is the biggest trading partner with South Africa, and it's one of the biggest with South Africa, and the biggest development partner with the African continent. Secondly, we see that the emergence of multilateral institutions such as the BRICS and others which are led by China, like the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, they are increasingly providing for a multilateral context that is aligned with the interests of African countries and countries from the global south. And I think where the United States is, they are observing these consolidating relations, which are defined as mutually beneficial to the participating countries. And there would be a sense in the US that the US is falling behind. Then the political tensions that you also mentioned, the differences in foreign policy orientations, and they also reflect the fundamental issues in terms of what AGOA says in terms of governance and human rights.
All right.
You see that countries in the global south are increasingly feeling that the US and much of the Western countries, they are double-faced when it comes to other issues which they would not prefer to address. Human rights in Palestine and human rights, yet they are very vocal when it comes to Ukraine. And these issues...
All right, I would like to stay with you on the political tension that, of course, you highlighted. Now, the geopolitical relationship between South Africa and the US of late has sort of clashed, or rather differ following the Russia-Ukraine war and also the Hamas, of course, Israeli conflict. Now, do you think the fluid relationship between the US and South Africa will, of course, impact on AGOA?
So I think that there is interest in, sorry about the phone, I think that there is interest within the US and let me switch off my phone. I think that there's mutual interest within the US, with particularly the Biden administration and the South African government to iron out relations. The key issue for South Africa is that the US has acted, or some officials in the US have acted in a manner that signifies that they would rather South Africa choose a side between other global players in other countries which South Africa would prefer to partner with in terms of trade and political relations. And this is a point that South Africa and other African countries and countries from the global south really detests. They view this as interference and an interventionist, direct interventionism into their domestic affairs, and particularly their self-determination to choose countries they would engage with and to choose their preferred policies, to decide to engage in trade based on partnerships which they would define themselves, whether they are choosing to do business with China or with Russia or any other countries. But you can also see that there is consistency in terms of what South Africa and other countries from the global south are calling for in terms of respect for global governance norms. So if it's human rights, if it's respecting international conventions, the debate, for example, around Palestinian, I think the voices of those who are saying Israel must be accountable, Israel must act with restraint, Israel should recognize the human rights conventions that guide conflict or war. There's convergence from South Africa and Africa and China in terms of calling for this position. And for me, this is a key fundamental norm that is universal, and the West must be seen to be obliging with that. So these differences do not necessarily hurt bilateral relations where countries recognize the independence and the self-determination and sovereignty of other countries, but they provide room for negotiating positions. And I would argue that we are in a historical geopolitical context where the West should start to listen and value perspectives that are emerging from the global south, whether it's from the African continent, whether it's from Asia, whether it's from China, because we are going into a multilateral context where part of Western dominance is diminishing.
All right, Gideon, before I let you go, in 30 seconds, how important is South Africa to the US as a multi-strategic partner?
Definitely, South Africa is very important. It is a key. South Africa is a key multilateral voice when it comes to issues concerning the African continent. Secondly, on multilateral issues, South Africa sits in quite a number of main global multilateral governance bodies, the UN, UN Security Council. South Africa is very active where peace is concerned in Africa, and recently we saw President Ramaphosa leading a delegation to Ukraine to try and mediate. South Africa's engagement with trying to raise a voice of a Palestinian, it resonates with quite a number of African governments who believe that Africans and the global South broadly should be a sober alternative voice to the Western voices. And I think that at this stage, the US cannot afford to ignore South Africa without overlooking so many African countries which take positions closer to the country.
All right, thank you so much for your time, Gideon Chitanga, of course, an international relations diplomacy expert. Once again, thank you so much.
You're welcome.